Okay, today we're going to be doing a watercolor beach tutorial with a photo that I took as a reference. So let's get started. The brushes I used varied. I used mostly round brushes. I used a large flat brush and a number 8 and number 6 round brush. And for the detail work, I use a 000 small Winsor Newton brush. But honestly, any brushes you have will probably work. The colors I use are Cerulean Blue, Ultramarine, Sap Green, Burnt Sienna, Yellow Ochre, and I also used a lavender color. So first thing I do is I sketch my horizon line, I sketch the beach shape on the left, and then the mountains in the background, and then the general shape of the foliage on the left too. I keep it really light so that the pencil doesn't mix in with my paint. First thing I do is I wet my paper, and then I go ahead and mix Cerulean with Ultramarine Blue. I do several layers, and I do move my brush as little as possible off the paper, meaning that I keep my brush as if it's magnetized to the paper, swishing back and forth to get a nice flat gradient. You can see I kind of messed up over here and overpainted where the foliage is, so I just gently lift it out and blot it with a paper towel. No problem. So anyway, we keep moving on, and then for the mountains in the background, I used like this light lavender color, but if you don't have that, it's really easy. You mix ultramarine blue with a little alizarin crimson until it looks kind of purple. I put a layer of water down first, and I noticed that the mountains ended up being a little too dark, so I went ahead and lifted it out, which is really easy. You just wet your brush, and you might even need to dab it with your paper towel a little bit, but just lightly pull away at the paint until it starts to get the right color. When I need to lift out, I usually use a stiffer bristle synthetic brush because it can take the rough scrubbing better than my nice brushes. So while the paper's still damp, go ahead and blend in the rest of the shades of, as you can see, of the darker purples that are in the mountains in the background. It's mostly just kind of blurred shapes, so it's probably not too much detail work you gotta do here. So just to smooth it out, I did one more light wash of the purple so that it's a nice smooth color gradient there. So the next thing I do is once I have my mountains kind of figured out and mapped out, I think about what am I going to do next. I'm going to do the water. So I need to wet the whole area where the water is going to be on the right side of the page. And then I mix ultramarine blue and cerulean blue and lighten it a fair amount with a damp flat brush, and then I zigzag a little bit like you can see here. And the darkest part of the water is on the far most right, and then I kind of blend it lighter and lighter towards the shore. There's also a subtle shadow where the mountains, or a reflection where you can kind of see like there's a darker area, and you can see up there where I kind of lighten it, darken it, lighten it, kind of to indicate that the mountain is reflected in the water. And I keep my brush damp, and then I kind of do that little ocean part in the back behind the rocks with the light cerulean and ultramarine blue. And the next step is going to be the shoreline, so I take another damp brush and I wet that area, and then I mix burnt umber and yellow ochre together to get this kind of tannish brown sandy color. And an important thing I've noticed about beaches is that there's a dark area where the sand is wettest, right where the water meets the sand, and then it kind of lightens up and gets darker and darker as you get further away from the water line. So as you see here, I got a little more burnt umber and a little more yellow ochre, and I put it right underneath where the water is touching the shore. And you can also see the sand through the waves, so there's some patches of that tannish brown color inside where the waves meet. You can see here, and then I kind of, to indicate the rocky shore. The next step for me was to do the forest on the side, so I take a wet brush and I mix Viridian with Sap Green, and I kind of darken a little bit with burnt umber. And I take a round brush, a wet round brush, and I press it, kind of dab at it to make these like organic leaf shapes. As you can see here, I kind of just press it randomly. I also take note of where the darkest shadows are in the forest, and I kind of paint that shape, whatever that shape is. I squint my eyes and I'm like, oh, that's shaped like an oval or a rectangle. And then I kind of, as you can see here, bleed it out a little bit with a wet brush. I'm not too focused on making it look exactly like the picture. I just want to give the feeling of leaves and texture. So I kind of just use like the side of my hand to press in and make those dabby leaf shapes. And I decide I'm going to come back to that, so I start back on the rocks. And for the rocks, I mix burnt umber and ultramarine blue and a little bit of Payne's gray. And I take note of where the darkest large rocks are. And I start with those, and I use my eyes to kind of estimate where the other rocks would be. My technique with these types of rocks is I find the darkest shadow and with a wet brush, and I bleed it out to create like a bubble shape of where the light part of the rock is. If you look closely, you can see that some of these rocks have really deep shadows and like dark areas, and then there's a light area, and I would liken it to a bubble where if you take like a little bit of water and then press around it, you can make the rock shape. So I go through and I add where all these dark rocks go, and in the foreground, to create a sense of depth, you are going to get more of those darker rock shapes, and they're going to be larger. So I go ahead and I add those, and I use the side of my paper towel to make it like a rough texture. And I keep going on the rocks around the edge and the deep shadows that the forest is leaving. And I did kind of get into intricacies with the rock, and I used my tiny little brush, as you can see up there, and I left kind of outline shapes. Those will be blurred out later. And now I'm going in and adding more and more dark shadows to the trees. My general technique is to start light, and then you can always add dark later. With watercolor, it is much easier to just layer in the darks later and start lighter than you think you need to, because you can always add more shadows. It's much harder to work the other way around and to lighten things. So I go here and I add more detail to where the foliage is, and I can see that the greens are much deeper and darker. And this is more of a Viridian Blue green, kind of a tropical color. And I'm mixing more burnt umber and Payne's gray to get the darkest shadows in the trees. And I'm taking my smaller brush, I think that's like a size 2, and bleeding it out. And now I'm taking my 000 tiny brush, and with the Payne's gray, I'm adding in the branches. And my trick with the branches is to kind of intersperse them randomly throughout the leaves. You can see like the lines kind of are not connected, and that kind of gives you the layered look of a forest. So I go back in and I'm finishing up my details, usually in the waves, which is the lightest part. I'm adding my cerulean and phthalo blue and a little bit of green here, and that is where I'm going to add the ripples and the texture of the water. Once again, I keep this pretty light, and I intersperse it kind of randomly. Notice there's like a wave shape in the background here where I'm lightly adding water to my brush and kind of pushing it back from where the darkest part of the wave is into the surrounding ocean. And similar to my tree technique, I'm taking my brush and lightly dabbing round organic shapes to indicate water. And this can feel really repetitious or really therapeutic depending on your point of view. If you like simply repeating, physical motions, this is going to be great for you. So I take my brush and I stipple it a little bit here and there and make like little wave ripple shapes. And the key is to make it kind of random. Don't make it too exact or mechanically similar, because that's not going to look very natural. So you can see here that I have all these different ripple shapes. And I add this with a wet brush, and even though it looks too dark right now, I kind of add some water and bleed it out more and make it look more natural and organic. And the key is right at the shoreline where the waves meet the ocean, you can kind of take a dry brush and very lightly dab some paint on there and make it look like sea spray. If you take a dry brush with some paint on it, you kind of have to get careful, because without the water, it's tricky to kind of get that sea spray texture. And then obviously the darkest ripples are the farthest right over where the water is deepest, and you kind of add a little bit more here and there, and those got darker blues and less of the green on there. Really want to make some pop, then get a whitewash and add some sea spray on top of your ripples. As you can see here, I'm using my tiny brush, adding some ripples. It's kind of dry because that's what I want, that nice bright white, and it kind of gives you that foamy look. And I think we're done. Here's a close-up look of all those textures and all that painting we just did, and here's another look at it. So I hope you're happy with this and that you had some fun and that you learned something new. And yeah, I'm so glad you're here, and don't forget to subscribe and like and share it with all the artists in your life. Thank you.